Welcome to The Conquering Truth. I'm Dan Horn.
I'm Jonathan Sides.
I'm Charles Churchill.
And I'm Joshua Horn.
Recently, a new book has come out about the time between the election and the inauguration of Joe Biden that Bob Woodward wrote. And in it, the part that seems to gain the most traction is these statements that Milley made, where he contacted the parallel general in the Chinese army and basically said things to him. And according to the book, what he said is, General Lee, you and I have known each other for now 5 years. If we're going to attack, I'm going to call you ahead of time. It's not going to be a surprise. It's not going to be a bolt out of the blue. And in response to this, people have been saying that he's, on one side they're saying, oh, he saved the republic because he was standing up to Trump and he wouldn't have let Trump blow up China. And on the other side, there's, the Republicans are saying, well, this is borderline treason. So how should we think about this? And what does it mean for us as a nation?
You kind of have a few different issues at play here. You have people accusing him of treason, and that's a very specific thing. It's a crime that's described in a very specific way. So the question is, does it qualify for that? And then you also have a broader thing is, was this insubordinate? Was this, how bad was it? And so you kind of have a range of things. But it seems like, there's... To go to the point and say, oh, he's committing treason, there's several problems with that. And I think one of the main problems with that is the actual definition of treason, because it does have a definition in the Constitution, in which the Constitution says, treason against the United States shall consist only in levying war against them or in adhering to their enemies, giving them aid and comfort. So treason is giving aid and comfort to an enemy of the United States. And despite what you might think, according to how this has been defined by the courts and somewhat by common sense, the United States does not have any enemies right now. We have nations that we get along with better than others, but we are not formally at war with any nation. And so the Chinese, they are a nation that we are at peace with. So even if he defected to the Chinese, that wouldn't be treason, because they are. It might be other crimes, it might be espionage, it might be all kinds of things, but it's not treason.
And it's one of the things that as a country we've been trying to, maybe the media would be a better way to say it, the media has been trying to redefine what an enemy is. Let's be serious. We have a lot of treaties with China. You look historically, the number of countries that you had treaties with wasn't that many. Now we have a lot of treaties with China that we honor, that we submit to one another. And we're going and saying that we're enemies with one another. You don't have treaties with enemies. With enemies, all treaties essentially get broken except for maybe some, treaties about how to treat prisoners of war and stuff. But it actually has to do with actually trying to destroy these United States.
One of the underlying principles that we're really trying to reinforce here is that words matter. And if you want to say that General Milley's words matter, you have to say that the Constitution's words matter. You have to say that the actual definitions of things, they actually matter. And there's this part of it where when you look at them, the quote that you read, and that's what I saw bandied about quite a bit, that's only a small part of the actual quote of what he said. It was a much longer quote. There was a lot more context. After the initial quote that you said, he went on and said, if there was a war of some kind or kinetic action between the United States and China, there's going to be a buildup, just like there has been always in history. And there's going to be tension, and I'm going to be communicating with you pretty regularly. The context of what he's saying is the United States has not fundamentally changed. We're not all of a sudden going to go to war with you. And and the point of this is not specifically even to defend Milley. The point of this is, if you want to be just, you actually have to give another person the exact amount or benefit of the doubt that you would expect to be given. You should not judge them any harshly than you would want to be judged. In fact, this is what Christ says. If you judge someone, you will be judged by that standard. And so there's a lot of people out there who have a strong desire to make us act unjustly. They want to take a snippet and they want to get you riled up. They want to make you angry. Donald Trump says something and they want to capture it and they want to say it's the worst thing that anyone has ever said in the history of the world. And the answer isn't to flip around and go, I'm going to do the exact same thing to someone on the other side of the political spectrum. The answer is to be just across the board.
And if you look at the specifics of what he's saying too, we said, he didn't commit treason, because you technically can't commit treason right now. So he didn't do it. No one has done it right now. But even what he's saying, what he actually says is, you take it in the worst possible light. He is promising to commit treason, where if the United States is attacking China, he's going to give them advance notice. So, that's what he's saying. And you don't get prosecuted for promising to commit treason if there is a war. So it's, but that is the thing that he's saying is, in this case, he would do it. So,
right.
One question is, does he actually mean it?
Right.
That it's very arguable, based on, how much in diplomatic stuff, is the full truth out there always? Is the full truth always being said? Not necessarily. So, I don't really believe that he's going to go call, and if there's a legitimate attack upon China, that he's going to go call them, because that would be treason, and, he's not going to do that.
And you put this in the context of, in October he talked to him, in January he talked to him, and he's basically saying, I talk to you regularly. You'll know if there's going to be an attack, because that relationship is going to change. I mean, that's fundamentally what his message is. And it's not rocket science. Of course, that relationship would change if we actually went to war.
The Democrats were pushing this narrative that Trump was crazy, and who knows, he might just launch nuclear weapons. And I think, he kind of has cultivated a crazy demeanor. So even if that's not true, he's not completely blameless, and people thinking he's crazy. So they're saying, he's disputing the election results, and so as a diversionary tactic, he might try to instigate a war with China by launching nuclear weapons against them. Now, you ask half the people in the United States, and they're going to say that's insane, and you ask the other half, and they'll say, well, that's a remote but very real possibility.
So, I mean, one thing as we think about the situation, we should recognize that it's really easy to portray this as the president walking into a room and pressing a button. But there's laws that govern how they can fire nuclear weapons. And those laws require, not optional, they require you to talk to the Secretary of Defense. They require you to talk to the chairman of the Joint Chiefs. They require you to consult with other military leaders as depending on the situation and who they are. And only after that can you even begin to fire a nuclear weapon. And it has to be confirmed by the Secretary of Defense that you mean to do it. There's a protocol that you have to get it from another card, or a card from another officer. So there are protections. There's not. It seems to me that the way that that Pelosi in particular was trying to portray it was Trump he's unstable and he could just press the button at any time. And it's not that simple.
But I think one of the reasons why she might be concerned about this is because I think there are far too restrictions on the use of nuclear weapons at one level. To avoid going down a 40-minute rabbit hole that has been cut out. But I think, personally, there's not a lot of laws that could be used to legally stop a rogue president, But putting that aside, to go out to the wider level, under our laws, the president can do a first strike on another country without a declaration of war. And he does need to get certain military leaders, he needs to at least consult with them. So there is some check on him. But the idea that the president can just go off and start wars, as he has done many times, not nuclear wars, but he's done many times over our history, that's something that's not right according to the Constitution and not right morally, that one person is deciding on what the war should be in a republic like we have.
So I want to take us back to this beginning quote in our discussion about General Milley. And so we talked about the reactions to him being potentially treasonous. And if you look at the law, by definition, China's not an enemy. He's not giving aid and comfort to an enemy. Ergo, he's not being treasonous. But is there some other level at which we could look at this? I mean, could we say that is there some other crime or malfeasance that's being perpetrated by him reacting this way and making these kinds of communications with China?
And I think even the Secretary of Defense basically said, I didn't authorize him to make the call. And so that means it was insubordinate. If the Secretary of Defense didn't think that he had the legitimate authority to make this call, and that seems to me the question that we should have is, was he being insubordinate?
Right. I think what he said is that he authorized the call, but he didn't authorize what is reported as he said. So
people don't really realize how, like when he said, I authorized the call, but not the content of the call. I mean, at Data Tech, I make a lot of calls, and there are times where I know someone's asking me a question, and I don't have authority to answer it. I don't have freedom to answer it without talking to you. And the military is much more structured then, you know, I mean, data tech, it's by convention and by knowledge of what the roles are. Military is a lot tighter than that. And so the statement that he made, I think, was along those lines of Milley stepped over that line.
And to some extent, it seems to me it's a lot worse what he did with Speaker of the House Pelosi when he talked to her, because according to what was reported in the book, and this is based on transcripts that they actually got from Congress, he basically agreed with Pelosi when she said that Donald Trump is unstable, Donald Trump is unhinged, I believe was another word that was used. And for him to say that about the President of the United States in a political sense, I mean, obviously Pelosi is very legitimately political.
Right.
But yet for him to involve himself in politics, that's what's usually considered crossing the line. And there's a good example of this with President Obama. He removed the General McChrystal that was in charge of Afghanistan because he wanted to do have more troops and do a counterinsurgency. And President or Vice President at the time, Biden, said, this is bad. We shouldn't do this. We shouldn't ramp up the troops like this. And so after a NATO meeting at a press conference, McChrystal said that Joe Biden's plan would create Chaosistan, was, I believe, the literal word. And it was carried in the Rolling Stone, did an article on this because they put a reporter in with McChrystal for a month. And it says, last fall, during the question and answer session following a speech he gave in London, McChrystal dismissed the counterterrorism strategy being advocated by Vice President Joe Biden as short-sighted, saying it would lead to a state of Chaosistan. The remarks earned him a smackdown from the president himself, who summoned the general to a terse private meeting aboard Air Force One. And that's the worst thing that he did. There was also in the article about some of his subordinates were saying nasty things about some other people. But in the end, when President Obama read this article, because of that, he was fired because this was insubordination, because he said this at a fairly obscure thing in London. And it seems to me intentionally putting yourself on the side of the Speaker of the House, Pelosi, who is the sworn enemy of the president, and agreeing that the president is unhinged, that seems a lot worse than this. And so if we look at historically where generals were allowed to get involved in politics, it wasn't nearly this far.
Right. But let's be clear about the criticism here is, the criticism is coming from certain people because a general was going towards a particular political side. If the roles were reversed, if it was a general now criticizing President Biden, you're going to have people saying, how dare they fire a general just for expressing the truth. And so, you kind of, there's a point where a general is not an effective commander because he's undermined his, relationship with the government or showing that he's not going to execute the orders he's given. But, a lot of the criticism is not entirely as it might seem.
Right. I guess my point more is that historically, those are considered to be like red lines that a general shouldn't be crossing. And these have been set down by Truman with MacArthur. MacArthur was trying to have his own backdoor diplomacy with China during the Korean War. And so he was fired for it. And so there has been practices that would draw the line, and that's the line that Milley crossed. And it's kind of disturbing. Mostly, to me, what's disturbing about it is if you accept that line's in the right place, and I think that we want to go there in this discussion, but if there's a line and you're enforcing it differently on one group of people, one group of generals than the other, that gets to be pretty dangerous. It gets to be pretty dangerous that he's allowed to play politics if he's pro-Democrat, or if in 2022, where it seems likely that the Republicans will gain seats and they'll control the House, they'll control the Senate, it seems like the most likely outcome. If you said all of a sudden he's calling, the Speaker of the House that's a Republican and saying bad things about President Biden, that would be equally problematic in my sight, because either way, it's undermining the chain of command.
Right. And I think one thing that is often forgot here is how much of politicians the top generals are. I mean, the famous quote from Clausewitz is war is politics by other means. And that kind of plays into the generals. Is they need to understand the government's political objectives. And usually that ends up meaning them taking a side one way or another in their personal opinion. And that affects their war policy and all these things. And so, when they start to come out and undermine the president, that is where they are getting themselves into trouble. But, if they the generals you're promoting, if you're doing it right, are the generals that are supporting the same political objectives, at least internationally, that you are.
I mean, one of the issues, though, is, if you go back in history, at least my experience has been, I'm not sure where it was when Obama, things were starting to get fairly polarized even under President Obama. But the conservatives generally, if they saw a military leader criticize the president, they would be more likely to support the president in pushing him down, because fundamentally what they wanted to support was the principle of the president has authority and the president actually is in a position and the other people had an obligation to follow and to not criticize him openly. And now it's gotten to the point where, like you're talking about, where it has become much more polarized, and on both sides we're willing to allow this greater freedom to someone because they hold a position. But that desire to kind of hold that line, that desire to actually say that the principle of authority really matters, that was actually that held people in place. There were people who wouldn't step out of line because of that. And so there's a greater freedom. I mean, in a sense, when you see Milley out there, what he's doing is he's openly admitting that he did this. He's being praised for having done it. And when somebody does this, there's in the future, other people look at it and they go, there's going to be a new thing called the Milley defense. I mean, and it doesn't even have to become the term, but in people's heads, they go, there's precedent for behaving in this way. Behaving in this way and using this argument is a legitimate form of behavior to take in this position, whereas in the past it wouldn't have been.
And I mean, there was a lieutenant colonel that got removed from his position just a few weeks ago because he said, the policy in Afghanistan is a mess. It's horrible what's happened there. And he gets removed from it because he plays politics, but then they're, applauding when Milley plays politics. This is a problem. And I completely agree with you, Joshua, as I say that there's this political aspect to the reason that you become a 4-star general. It's politics, right? But at the same time, the politics is supposed to be for the military, not you messing in domestic politics. So all these guys are expert politicians that reach that level of command. But there's also these rules in place to try to constrain these excellent politicians from playing political games in domestic politics, and that's exactly what he did.
Right, and I think that's a good example that with that Marine who was removed from his position and resigned is, there you had the conservatives, or at least a certain segment of the conservatives, saying he's speaking the truth and they're removing him, which is I think that's true.
I think he should have been removed, right. But I also think he was speaking the truth.
Right. And there's a point where it comes down to if you're in the military and you're criticizing the president, maybe you need to do that. But you need to make sure it's an important issue and realize you might be seeing yourself out by doing that.
There's a lot more politicalization of the military, even with what some of the CRT stuff and other things that are being taught in the military.
Right, and I think one big thing is with the military mandating vaccines for everybody, the COVID vaccine. And, you even see how a lot of things in society become politicized, where they already had to take these vaccines, and now this one's being pushed, and people are resigning, people are leaving, and without saying which one is right, that is a real politicization where a good segment, I don't know what the percentage is going to be, but it's going to be a percentage that's going to resign, saying the military has been politicized.
And so I think if we look at the broader picture too, there's things that Americans don't think could ever happen here. But we should also be realistic about what's happened in the history of the world, because there's constantly been this tension between, on one hand, you can be like Saddam Hussein, who tells his military what to do, and they would do it irrespective. It didn't matter if it was legal, it didn't matter if it was illegal. And so the military acted as a group of thugs for the president of the country. Or you can look in South America, and repeatedly what happens is that a general decides he doesn't like the president of the country, and he will do a military coup and take over the country. So this idea of having civilian control of the military and how those two balance each other, it can easily go wrong on either side.
I think one of the things at play is when you talk about tensions, there's a lot of part of it where we don't really know what those tensions are and what things actually keep things in place, or what the founders intended those things to be, and some of them have gone away. I mean, the simplest form of tension in history was a paycheck. Was, like the person who controls your salary, they have a lot of influence over you. I mean, if you go back to even like the colonies, there was an issue where if King George wanted to be able to pay and directly pay the judges or officials over here, and the colonies said, no, we need to be able to pay them, and they understood these fundamental controls. And so I think there are some of these controls that people don't even have an idea of what they are, and they don't understand as they disappear or as we buy into things that sound good, that we're actually weakening the position and we're actually causing more problems and more likelihood of what you're talking about with like military coups.
So could a military coup happen here?
A military coup could happen in any country. I mean,
that was what I was trying to get somebody to say, is because I think most of our listeners we think of this happening in other countries, but we go in the United States, it happens.
And not that it's going to happen.
Not that it's going to. I mean, but none of us should be naive enough to think that somehow it couldn't happen in the United States. Of course, it could.
But based on our earlier discussion, you're of the opinion that the chances and likelihood of it are increasing.
Yes.
Over time, that what we're talking about now wasn't possible 40 years ago, 100 years ago, whatever. I mean, what would be the reasons for that? Why is it getting to be that case where these tensions are becoming more and more strained?
One thing to even go back to what you were talking about military officers being political. And one of the reasons why this is a tension, why you want to keep military officers from being political, is politics is where you cause the people to, you seek the approval of the people by your actions. This is basic. And so when a military official is able to use the power of the military to seek approval from the people, someone who has control over a part of the military goes out and he attacks a place, or he bombs some section, and he does this on his own authority, but he does it to appeal to the people. That's a very dangerous thing. You don't want anyone with guns, directly with guns, being able to go, I can go out, I can use these guns, and I can kill people, and this is going to increase my political power. The president already can do that in some ways, but he has to go through these other forces. And so there's this real danger of, one of the reasons why you smack anybody down who tries to do this is because it's really powerful once they start doing it, because there's a percentage of people go, this guy gets stuff done. This guy knows how to make stuff happen in the world. He doesn't sit around with committees and going through all these other checks and balances. He sees somebody else are doing something evil, and he goes out and he destroys them. That's really appealing to a part of the population. And the power to take revenge on your enemies is so if you speak out against this guy, he can come and smack you down and say you were a threat to the nation. And so this is a really fundamental thing that if we allow that to happen, it could change the dynamics of politics incredibly quickly.
And having been in Nigeria, right, where this actually happens, right? I mean, where they send in the military, a place that I was at in July, what I've heard from people that were on the ground there is that the military sent in to drive people out of their homes so that the Muslims could come in and burn all the homes down afterwards. And so the military is doing these things, which creates terror, which you can imagine how that shifts voting.
Right. And
all of a sudden the governor is trying to appease the Muslims, and he could care less about the people that were killed, so he's only talking about the Muslims that were killed. And I've seen this. I've been present in places where this actually is literally happening right now. And for us to be naive and think that if the president, and there's a reason why the military is not allowed to operate within domestic borders for this reason, because when there was the shift that happened a long time ago about a standing army and things like that, there were things put in place to try to protect the United States from moving that direction. But I don't think those protections are as strong as we want to believe.
Right.
I mean, you look at, it was a few years ago, I remember that President Trump was trying to plan some sort of, I think it was a July 4th parade with tanks going through Washington, D.C., and the Democrats were saying, oh, you can't do this. This is, basically doing what you're talking about. And, So even if you're a Trump supporter, you don't dismiss that criticism. I mean, that's a legitimate criticism to say, you know, you don't want the country to be militaristic and that the military is being used in any way to intimidate people. I mean, having not as cool of a July 4th parade comes way below approaching anything where you're using the military against civilians in an improper way.
So, I mean, what you mentioned about the standing army, I think that the fact that in the Constitution you were not allowed to have a standing army, that's a pretty big deal. I think it's even something that a lot of people aren't even aware of. And it's been something that we, you know, I don't know how long we've even followed it correctly, but I mean, it changed pretty early in the nation, but it's been something that leads itself in the direction you were talking about. I mean, I think that's worth discussing a little more.
If we go to the Constitution, right, just to be very clear about what it actually said and what the documents of America say. To raise and support armies, these are what some of there's 18 things that the Congress is allowed to do, and these are 3 of them that are related to military things. To raise and support armies, but no appropriation of money to that use shall be for a longer term than 2 years. That's the term that says it can't be a standing army. The army can only be good for 2 years. That's all you can appropriate it for. So you can't say somebody can retire after 25 years because you can only do it for 2 years at a time. And so was their means to prevent a standing army. To provide and maintain a navy, you had to provide for a navy because you had to build ships. It was a capital investment. So because of that, you needed to maintain them. And there was always a border to maintain. And then to make rules for the government and regulation of the land and naval forces. So these are what the Congress had the responsibility to do, and not the president. And the reason that they didn't want a standing army is they saw what happened with standing armies. If you have a standing army, you go to war. Everybody knows this. This is like a really basic political fundamental rule. If you have a standing army, you go to war. And I mean, hey, President Trump didn't go to war much because he did attack Syria a few times, but he didn't start a new war.
He didn't start new wars.
He didn't start any new wars, which is very different than the presidents before him. That's how rare it is if you have a standing army not to have wars. And even as we had a standing army, as you go through, like after World War I, there was a standing army, but the standing army wasn't like we think of as a standing army. Meaning right now, we haven't been at a declared war for a long time, but yet we have as big of an army as we did like during World War II, as opposed to when World War I, there was a huge drop-off in the number of people in the military. And what the standing army was more of a structure that would get populated when you went to war. We don't do that anymore. We go to war without drafts. We go attack places. We don't need to do a draft. We don't need to get young men to sign up. We don't need to do any of that because we have a real standing army, an army that's ready to go to war at any moment. And so this has been a 220-year shift where we slowly move that direction. But that is why it's different now.
And I think when you were, to go back to even something you were talking about nations can't go to war super fast, even with standing armies. So part of the goal was to focus on defense more than on offense. And so, I mean, and this gets a little more complicated in the sense of the states had an obligation to have militias and to have people who could be, if the nation was attacked and they knew there was a certain speed at which they could be attacked, it wasn't like you're going to snap your fingers and 1 million people were going to be on your borders. It was that they would be coming. And so the states needed to be in a position to which you could put an army in place. And once that army was in place and called up, at that point, the federal government would be in charge of that army. But to get that army, they had to call it up out of the states. And the states had to go, oh, right, this is a threat we actually have to deal with. Not, we've got these people sitting around and there are these generals who would like to be promoted and they've trained in the art of war and they want to practice the art of war. And the only way to really get promoted is to go to war. And so you create these pressures that if you have an army, you want to use it.
Yeah, when you go back to kind of the founding generation like you were talking about, that there was people saying we should not have a standing army. And that quickly, went away, where there were troops that were always there. But it would increase and come down because there was a realization that, especially in modern times, you need people to maintain things like nuclear weapons. And, having people come in on the weekends, probably not a realistic way to do that. That's probably not going to work. So, since very early, we've always had soldiers. But the question is, how is the military structured? Is it structured to be something that is ready to defend against someone, a surprise attack? But the primary way they're going to defend is by having people trained that are not full-time soldiers that are able to come into those roles. Right. And people say that it's impossible, and to a certain extent they're right. But one of the reasons why we don't do that is because we don't try. Because people want a standing army. They want the United States to have this force available to go implement its will across the world. And that's what people in Congress want. That's what the president wants. That's what the military wants. So there's this unity of motivation to say we need a standing army, whether or not that's actually entirely true.
The American people have been sold a view of America that just is false. We have been sold a view that America is the righteous nation, that we only go to battle for the right reasons. And I'm sorry, it's just false. We have this view of ourselves that we should have a standing army because we'll do the right thing with the standing army. And we won't.
Right. We're like Google, don't be evil. And then it doesn't work
it's
for
exactly
that long.
That's a good example. It doesn't work for that long because President Trump, I think there was some truth to what President Trump said when he said, the normal soldiers, they all love me and the generals all hate me. And the reason that he said that was he said they all hate me because I won't keep going to war. Because the generals like to send people into war because that's how they get promoted. That's how they move up. You have to have, you have to have been leading in battle. You have to have, in order to get promotions, to move from colonel to general and lieutenant colonel to colonel is you need these experiences. And you can only have those experiences if there's war.
They don't even have to be bloodthirsty to want it. They want the glory of combat. They want the glory that comes from those things. And so, it's just a different form of greed. It's not necessarily for money. It's for prestige, for power, and for promotion.
The state militia now is called the National Guard. And even you look at that name where they've made it into something that's national, where you're not part of the New York militia or the North Carolina militia. Now you're part of the National Guard, the North Carolina National Guard. Even that name, they're really pushing it to be, to be a national thing. When even in the laws, it is still, well, constitutionally, because we still have the same constitutions, it is a state organization. I think a lot of people would look on the governor's involvement as a relic of the past that would be ideally gotten rid of. But you look at, even under the law, how it was originally set up and still applies in most states, probably all states, is that every able-bodied man of a certain age, of military age, is part of the unorganized militia.
Right.
And they're the ones who, under our system, the country is supposed to be relying upon for defense. Is everyone has a responsibility to defend the country, and that goes through the states to the federal government when necessary. But there's this push to centralize all that in a standing army that is under the president, to not even under Congress.
And even the National Guard, the training of the National Guard, the way they train and stuff is national, not
right.
They get their training materials. They get they get it from the federal government, not the state government. So they're not unique militias. And the argument for it is they'll be a lot more efficient if they all have the same training because then they can all work together and there won't be any, differences. But, that wasn't the original plan. The original plan is that they were trained at a state level and then they would be all called up to work together when it was a national emergency.
And in the end, what you said about the governors being a relic of that, that's really, it's the viewpoint of the people that really causes the change. Because if the people say, if the president asks for it, the governor has to give it, then the governor is going to end up, that's what he's going to get not reelected for if he refuses it. You know what I mean? There's this part of it where it is the view of the people that changes these things. If the people begin to say, we need to see much greater decentralization of the authority, if that was the attitude of the American people, it would begin to happen. And it would begin to happen because there would be people who would seek power by giving the people what they want. And so, there is this part of it where where it really changes is what do the people want? And I think we're going to do maybe not tonight, but we're going to do another podcast on, do we really want a tyrant or a king to rule over us? And there's a part of it where more and more we do. And that attitude is eroding the things that protect us from that authority. And
I think it goes back to the question that we addressed. Well, it goes back to a statement that was made earlier, which is that Americans don't think that there could be a military coup in the United States. And the reason that the military is structured the way it is, with everyone being part of the militia, with it going through the governors, is because the founders recognized, yes, there could be a military coup in the United States. And so we need to decentralize this to make it so that there is, 13 or now 50 people who are in a position as the governor of the state to stop tyranny.
And I do think it's, you look at what the president being the commander-in-chief, I mean, people go, oh, that's not a military position. Well, the way that George Washington interpreted this is when they went to suppress the Whiskey Rebellion, the person who rode at the head of the army was General Washington. He went as president, I'm the commander-in-chief, so I'm supposed to be leading the army. It was certainly thought of by the founders that this was a military position. So when you say that, these generals are supposed to have civilian leadership, no, they're not. And they have a commander.
Of course, it also helped that he had commanded all the U.S. forces during the American Revolution. So
absolutely, and he ended up not actually going the whole way because he appointed Light Horse Harry Lee to lead it. But the interpretation of the Constitution was such that he thought he had to go out as a military officer when the militias were called out.
And I think that, and the distinction I think that people make with the president as a civilian is because when you come up, especially when you're coming up through this standing army, and so you spent 40 years, 50 years in this military system, you develop, you're part of this select group, and to have someone who officially is the commander-in-chief, but it is not from that thing, is very different. And so when you're looking at like the risk of a military coup, well, if you have a person who is not from this system at the head of it, then there's a lot less, he is a civilian in the sense that he's not going to have the same worldview that gets ingrained in you as part of the military. And there is this difference here where he is someone from outside.
I mean, so if somebody's following along at home, I could see them being a little bit confused in one sense, because on one hand, we're saying Milley really wasn't treasonous. Milley was insubordinate. But, hey, there should be checks and balances because there can be a coup. And even though Milley is saying that he's trying to prevent a coup, I actually think that he was wrong in doing what he did. And the reason for that is it goes back to Scripture. You're supposed to follow the structure of the law of the government that you have. I mean, with, like you said, we have an executive branch. We have the authority in the case vested in one individual, and through those who are under him, who he's appointed, and they've been appointed by the people who've elected these people into position, and they've been approved by the legislature. And if you don't like the decision that they made, you don't get to just go and make your own policy. I mean, even when you go back to the whole whistleblower thing that happened, a big part of it was just there were people who didn't like the policy that the President of the United States was establishing. And there were people who were willing to say, we're going to support you while you openly discuss the fact that that policy shouldn't have been pursued. And this is where we're moving toward. And so, I mean, there really are foundational principles here. And so you can look at it and go, we need to change some of the way we think about these things. We need to move so that we put some of these safeguards back in place. And at the same time, the people who are there should follow the laws that exist, and we should be a people of principle and following order.
It's really important for us to get back to where is that separation. When we want the military to report to civilian leadership. If we think that's going to happen in the executive branch, we are being incredibly naive. The way that you have the battles, the way you have the fights is that you have 435 people discussing it that are representing 435 different groups of people in the United States. And you have the 100 senators that are representing the 50 states. And you have that debate and that control. A lot of the things that have happened and the way that we have gotten here is we actually we don't want to have to make these decisions anymore. And with the legislature and Truman basically gave it to the UN to decide. And that's how we got into Korea. And so with that shift, we broke it and we broke our system. And we need to get our system back to, no, I don't think we'll get back to what the Constitution actually says. But at least we should move back to the principles that are there that are important if we actually want the civilians to control the military. Because like you said, the paycheck is where it comes from. The legislative branch has the purse, because if they go, the military's not doing this, they go, you don't have to pay taxes. We're wiping out the taxes and we're not going to pay the military anymore. And the military then has to attack everybody and the military has trouble. I mean, it just gets to be very complicated. There's a real check that would require, things to get really bad for it to happen, but there's a real check there that stops the military.
A paycheck.
A paycheck. When we think of the reason that we need to have true separation, it goes to the heart of man. And the reason that people are saying we don't need true separation is because it's rejecting the doctrine of total depravity. What we go is we say, if we like Trump, well, of course everybody should just obey whatever he does because we'll want what he does instead of going, he's a depraved man, you give him too much power, and that depravity will manifest itself. There needs to be checks and balances. Or President Biden the same way. You don't want everybody to just automatically do whatever President Biden says, and you don't want them also to just do whatever's right in their own eyes because that's as much of a disaster as the other one. One of the reasons that in the United States that all our checks and balances are breaking down is theological. It's that we've rejected the doctrine of total depravity.
We have this, there's the common saying, power corrupts, absolute power corrupts absolutely, and it's wrong. Man's already corrupt. I mean, power draws out the corruption. Power pulls it out. Power, power calls it and gives it an avenue to express itself. But it's not necessary. Man's already corrupt. And I think that's that's what you're saying is we think it takes something to tempt man to be evil. Man's already there. He even is looking for things. And so there's this part of it where you have to have that proper view. And we've talked about this in probably every podcast we've done. The church doesn't properly think about man. The church doesn't properly describe man. The church doesn't think about depravity. So why would the world?
And the church doesn't declare these things to the world around it. It doesn't think that it has anything to say. And this is a really fundamental thing that it has to say. The reason that I've been strongly advocating, you need to shift it back so the powers in the legislative branch versus the executive branch. So there is this check.
If you have the idea that men are inherently wicked, then they're only constrained by the church, by things they're taught growing up, but they do have that heart of sin unless they're converted, then you're going to structure government in a way where you recognize that if people are given power, they're going to use that power. Because, the power corrupts statement is wrong, and absolute power corrupts absolutely is wrong, but at a superficial level, it's correct.
Right.
That power allows you to, unrestricted power allows that corruption to come out. And the more power you're given, the greater that's going to come out. So that is the foundation of a lot of our government, of a lot of things in our society, is the idea that men are corrupt. And if there aren't checks and balances where people are working against each other, where even their sinful motivations are working to constrain other people's sinful motivations, then you're going to have a government that goes into tyranny, that goes into oppressing the people.
And the mechanics behind that go back to the wicked heart of man. If you set up a government that's structured in order to try and constrain the wicked heart of man, then you should expect that as men become more wicked, one of the things that they're going to be attacking are those structures that are put in place to constrain them. So when we've had a whole conversation this evening about how we think that the government was structured better at one time and that structure is starting to disintegrate, it's disintegrating because we don't care about God. It's disintegrating because there are men who are saying, hey, I would like to have less constraint on my ability to exercise my sins. That's how we got into this place.
And the church isn't even shining light out in such a way that it goes, this is what other people are going to do to you, right? I mean, because it doesn't even need to go, this is who you are. The church, by shining light, it causes people to say, I should constrain these other people because if I give them all the power, they'll use it to abuse me. But the church no longer says that. Instead, the church goes to the government and says, the government save us. Stop this, do that. Instead of going, no, the church should be speaking to the nature of things so that people recognize their own risk in the situation so that they act.
Right. I mean, we've talked about this in the sense that the way you start to understand these things is you read Scripture, you start to study doctrine, you learn to apply Scripture to the world around you. I mean, and I mean this in a really practical sense. I mean, tomorrow we're going to have something delivered to our house, and I'm not going to be able to be home when it's delivered. And so there are going to be a couple of men who are going to come by the house, and they're going to deliver something. They're going to have to move things around in the house and set something up. And, my wife often is nervous about men coming into the house. And she's always, but there's this part of it where, first of all, there's going to be 2 men coming. Second of all, they're going to be coming from a place where I know who the names of the people that are going to be coming. The names of the people that are coming are known by the people who sent them out. And those things are real constraints on, if one of those men thought, hey, I'm not worried about keeping my job, I'm not worried about doing whatever, I'm going to go and do this and then I'm going to run away. There's this part of it where, somebody knows who he is. He would have to go and be on the run. He has an identity. He has a job. And those things are real constraints. And it's very different than going on Craigslist, calling some guy and asking him to come by your house. There are these things that you can actually take and you can think about. And once you can think about yourself, once you can think about people around you, and you can start to understand this, you can start to apply doctrine to larger things. And there's a part of it where this scripture talks about by use, being able to take scripture and being able to, this is how you become someone who can teach others. This is how you become someone who can understand the world around you, is that you learn to use doctrine in your life. And it's one of the ways that keeps people from being able to cause you unnecessary fear, because there are people who will try to terrify you about something, and it's something you don't know much about. But if you can actually apply the things you know about yourself to it, you can go, actually, I don't think there's as much there for me to fear. And this is why we're so susceptible, is we don't have an understanding of the world. We don't have an understanding of ourselves. We don't know how to take doctrine and apply it to the world. And it creates these situations, and it feeds them.
I think this is something where, we've been talking for a while here about this very high-level stuff that none of us are almost certainly ever going to be in a position where we're, declaring war on someone or attacking someone attacking someone without declaring war. But this is something where when you look at the heart of it and you look at the heart of why these things are in place, this is something that we all need to be going out and applying every day. And it's not just saying, I understand the Calvinistic doctrine of total depravity. It's like the things you're talking about, recognizing, that people's hearts are sinful, but recognizing the constraints that are put upon them. And this is something you can apply in your family, where you're saying, if my children aren't saved, if family members aren't saved, then how should I treat them? And even in the church, people that do claim to be saved, that there are places where even people who are saved, you should have checks and balances in place for things like, counting the money or counseling or meetings or all these there's many different areas where even where you don't need to be, it should not be offensive to be putting checks on place, because that we recognize that there are hypocrites in the world, there are liars in the world, and there are even sins in the heart of believers. And so to put checks and balances in place, that's what we ought to be doing.
It's a loving thing to do.
We're saying bad things happen because bad theology runs amok. And I'm sure there's people who are listening to this podcast who have really good theology. And what you're saying, Joshua, is if you keep your doctrines all pinned up and they're just things that you enjoy in their own little petting zoo, and you're like, oh yes, I believe in the doctrine of the depravity of man. Let it loose. Let that thing go out there and just absolutely rampage over all of the rest of your thoughts. Let those doctrines actually mean something and then apply them somewhere else. That's what we'd really like to happen as a result of a conversation like this. Right.
Read Proverbs and realize, when it's saying careful what street you're going down, that's Calvinism speaking there.
When you look at the founding era, I don't think you look back and you look at some of the men involved and, hey, John Adams wasn't a Christian. Thomas Jefferson wasn't a Christian. George Washington was questionable. You look at these founding men, and yet because of what happened the generation before with the Great Awakening, they were thinking this way even without being saved, because that's the influence that the world's supposed to have, or the church is supposed to have on the world. And we look at a document like this and say, no, there's a reason why they did that. There's a reason why the militia was from the state and it goes to the president to have the power. And there's a reason why it has to be the Congress that does it. They put all these checks and balances in because they had been taught the doctrine of total depravity without really being part of the church. That's a really important thing to understand. That's the influence the church is supposed to have. And until the church has that influence in society again, we can't fix the problem with having a civilian in charge of the military, because you can't fix it because you don't understand the nature of the problem, because it's the church that has to look at it and say, this is what it looks like when you shine the light of God's word upon it. This is where the problem is. And the world doesn't know that, and the church isn't doing that. So thanks for joining us as we talk about these things. It's really easy for us to put doctrine off to the side. And one thing is, you think of Jesus Christ being tempted in every way that we are, yet without sin. What that required was for him to be incredibly tempted, because a president that doesn't like all the things going around him, that actually has control of the military, he's really tempted to break the law. Really great temptation. And he's not Christ, and he'll fall. And so what we need to recognize is when we put people into that situation, we're rejecting the doctrines of Christ. We're acting like man can be holy, righteous, and good as Christ was. And it's simply not true. And we need to start thinking about it in our lives and in how the structure of our government is, so that we stop being a nation that is always going to war. Thanks for joining us.
This has been The Conquering Truth, a project of Reformation Baptist Church. If you found this helpful, you can visit us online at theconqueringtruth.com and subscribe here or in your favorite podcast app. Thanks for watching.